Welcome everybody to the last of the fall lecture series for 2021. My name is Carrie Soden. I'm the Archaeological and Research Director here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Thank you all, as always, for signing up and showing up. Please don't forget, you can always still give at nmgl.org/donate. Tonight is the end of our fall lecture series, as I mentioned. Tonight we have a new form of a hybrid event. I talk to you tonight here from my office at home. Bruce Lynn, our speaker, is in his office in Northern Michigan, and Ellen Kennedy is with a group of members at NMGL for our very first watch party. A few technical notes. As always, if anything were to happen to your feed tonight, please be aware that we are taping this evening, and we'll hopefully have it up on our YouTube channel. I'd say Friday, but hopefully Monday, Tuesday, if need be. I will send a link out to all registered participants when that does go up. And I said I enabled the closed captionings 3 weeks ago. Apparently I did not. This time I actually have. If you would like closed captioning, please just hit the closed captioning button and you should be able to see our auto-generated closed captions. And finally, if you have any trouble with your audio or video at any time, please just close out the Zoom and log back onto this webinar again. That's what tends to fix most of the problems. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the talk. For those of you here, raise your hand and Ellen will allow you to come to the microphone and ask your questions of Bruce. For those of you that are online, joining us online, please post your questions in the Q&A section. Tonight we have Bruce Lynn with his presentation entitled Braving the Waves, Life-Saving Service on the Shipwreck Coast. Bruce was raised actually in Northwest Ohio, which I did not know, and enlisted in the Army immediately after high school and served in Germany with 7th Cavalry. After his honorable discharge from the Army, Bruce studied at the Ohio State University. I should know that now, I have that in my house, where he specialized in American history. While attending OSU, he spent his summers working on Mackinac Island at Fort Mackinac as a historical interpreter. Upon graduation, Bruce was accepted into Eastern Michigan University's Historic Preservation Program, where he studied heritage interpretation with Toledo's own Ted Ligabell, who I know is signed on this evening. Hello, Ted. During his time there, Steve worked for Talk World Discovery in the summers and later completed an internship at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. Once he finished his master's work, Bruce went to work full-time for the Mackinac State Historic Parks. During the rest of his career, he's worked as a curator for the Alfred P. Sloan Museum in Flint, I'm going to say Piet Castles in West Liberty, Ohio, and was hired by the Ohio Historical Society to assist with the creation of an economic impact survey of historic sites for the Ohio State Legislature. In 2011, he was rehired by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society as operations manager and now serves as the executive director at the Shipwreck Museum. And with that, I will leave you guys to enjoy Bruce and all that he has to say.
Thank you, Carrie. And I think I'm probably going to need to thin that bio down at some point. That was getting kind of long. And hello to everybody out there. Thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. Those of you at the museum or any of you that are at home watching. Again, thanks for joining us. And thank you, Carrie, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Shipwreck Coast and the life-saving service and shipwrecks and all those things that we like to interpret up at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and we'll be able to get started on this and get my PowerPoint going. I know a lot of you will probably end up having questions as we go along here, and I think Carrie's going to handle this at the very end, as she stated earlier. So keep those questions in mind as we go on. We're going to cover a lot of territory, but we'll go ahead and get started. And I would say that this crowd, I'm going to make some assumptions that many of you know a little bit about the life-saving service probably, and a little bit about some of the shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. And I'm sure you know a lot about the ones down in Lake Erie, but I'm sure we have viewers that are familiar with some of the shipwrecks up on Lake Superior as well. And what I'm going to talk about tonight are some of these shipwrecks, but I'm also going to talk about some of the government efforts to do something about the aftermath of these wrecks. And like at Whitefish Point, and this is the home of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, we're a National Historic Sites, and that lighthouse you see in the picture was actually built during Abraham Lincoln's administration, and it's still an active lighthouse. So we like to tell people all about that history. And you know, your lighthouse keepers that would have been at places like Whitefish Point were, as a part of their duties, required to help shipwreck survivors, or do what they can or what they could in the case of a shipwreck. It wasn't their primary duty. So we're not going to talk about the lighthouses quite so much, but we will reference Whitefish Point quite a bit, and I'll talk a little bit about you know, some of the life-saving stations along this 80-mile strip of shoreline that starts here at Whitefish Point and goes all the way to the west to the area of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore and Grand Island. You could kind of put Whitefish Point at the eastern end of that shoreline and the Grand Island North Lighthouse, and really Grand Island itself, kind of the western end of what has come to be known the Shipwreck Coast. There's over 200 shipwrecks right in that area. If you take a look at this slide right here, this is Whitefish Point. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is Whitefish Point, and we go west. My cursor just disappeared there. There it is. So we go west and we end up right there to Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, and there's Grand Island right there. Along that whole shoreline, we get down to the Whitefish Bay here a little bit. As I was saying, there's about 200 shipwrecks roughly. And there's a number of different reasons for these shipwrecks. That's one of the primary questions that we get from people who come up to the museum. They're asking, why so many shipwrecks? What was happening that so many ships were getting into trouble? And you really can't discount the weather. That's the first thing that really comes to mind. And if you look at Lake Superior, we've got this whole broad sweep of the lake, and typically your prevailing winds and storms are coming in out of the northwest. So they've really got a good length of Lake Superior to build up energy and intensity. So it tends to slam along this shoreline that we're talking about right through here. It's also, and if you look at Whitefish Point and you look at this area of Whitefish Bay right here, all the ship traffic coming in and out of Whitefish Bay and into Lake Superior, so in and out of Lake Superior, they must go right past Whitefish Point. So you get traffic through there, and really collision was a big problem in certain areas. Prior to a lot of the technology we take for granted today, GPS and radar and everything else, all those technologies that came along over the years helped to at least help to prevent some of these shipwrecks from collision. We can't discount human error with all of that ship traffic as well, so that was a big thing. But there's another slide I'm going to show in a few seconds that would give you an explanation also as to why there's so many shipwrecks. You know, there are 200 shipwrecks right in that area, and most people are coming to Whitefish Point and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum to learn about one. And this is it, the Edmund Fitzgerald, which sank on November the 10th, 1975. Obviously, I'm sure all of you are aware of it. Gordon Lightfoot the following year wrote a song that went to #2 on the Hot 100 Billboard chart, and there you go. I mean, everybody, well, everybody, a great many people now had an understanding, or at least had heard of the name. And, you know, in a lot of cases, people didn't realize that it was a story of a real shipwreck, but obviously it was. And it sank 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. The bell from the Fitzgerald was recovered in 1995, and it's been on exhibit in the museum ever since. So really, a great many people are coming up to visit us to learn about this shipwreck, which is the one that really, in some ways, like Fred Stonehouse put it, has come to represent shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. But there's so many out there that really most people have never heard of. And a big part of our mission is to go out and discover a lot of these shipwrecks. We had a lot of luck this year. And then document those wrecks, interpret them in the museum, and maybe the Fitzgerald becomes the draw, but the people while they're up there can learn more about the wrecks. Now, if you take a look at this slide right here, you can see Whitefish Point. You can see where my cursor is. If we go all the way going west, you can see Grand Marais. We get into the area of Munising and the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. There's one thing that you really can't see in there, because it doesn't really exist. There's really no harbors. Outside of Grand Marais, there was no place for the ship traffic to get in if they were to get into trouble. So if a big storm hits, like some of the shipwrecks that we're going to talk about here tonight, and they needed to try to find safe harbor, they really didn't have any place to go, unless they were pretty close to Grand Marais, and that was still a pretty tight harbor anyway. So weather could cause a lot of problems for these crew members and the captains of these ships, and often they didn't have much of a choice as their vessel would be getting pushed ashore. So if you look at, and we're going to go way back here, if we look at the earliest eras of commercial ship traffic, if you want to call them ships, these in the era of the fur trade, and you think of these big 30-foot Montreal canoes, if the weather got really nasty, Well, you might have a scene that looks something like this. They could get onto the shoreline, they could pull that big canoe up, get it out of the water. They could almost use it as their tent in some ways, if you look at this image. But as we progressed through the years, we started to see more and more vessels looking like this. They did not have that same ability to just simply be pulled up on the shoreline. This vessel you see right here, we're going to talk a little bit later in the program. This is the Nelson, the Shipwreck Society. We discovered this vessel in 2014. It was originally built as a barkentine. It was considered one of the most beautiful barks operating on the Great Lakes, and that was 1866. It was built in Milwaukee, and about 33 years later, it got into trouble on the Shipwreck Coast. So we'll be talking about that one. But as we progressed through the years, we were getting further and further away from such craft as Montreal canoes, and we were really seeing ships operating in the lakes. If this was 1860s, 80s, 90s, and so on, if we look at the mid 1840s, we saw the first steamer being brought up onto Lake Superior. This artist's conception shows what it might have looked like in 1845 when the Independence was being portaged. And for all of you who have visited Sault Ste. Marie, you drive on Portage Avenue. You're passing the Sioux Locks. That's where all the gift shops are. And you're driving on Portage. Well, it was called Portage Avenue for a reason, because there was a lot of portaging that was taking place. And in one case in 1845, the Independence, again, that first steamer to operate on Lake Superior, was being portaged from the Lake Huron level to the higher Lake Superior level and around the rapids at that point. So, and the Independence got into trouble. It's amazing how many of these shipwrecks you research. Well, if it was 1845 when it went into Lake Superior, about 8 years later, it was on its way. Last trip of the season, November 1853, headed out to the Keweenaw. It was actually the last trip of the season, and no more than a couple miles away from Sault Ste. Marie, there was a boiler explosion that destroyed the ship and sent it to the bottom. And a part of the keel of this vessel is actually on exhibit inside the Shipwreck Museum today. So it was kind of an unfortunate end to this tough little steamer that was going back and forth. If you think of places like Whitefish Point, when this one was operating, that smoke on the horizon you would see, well, it was the one vessel that was putting out there, and then more steamers obviously came in later years. But if this was 1845, 10 years later, the Sioux Locks opened up, and now we really had this, it was like the floodgates were open with ship traffic. Tons of ships coming and going, and the tonnage was increasing every single year. And so if you think about it statistically, with more and more ship traffic easily, as opposed to being portaged, easily being able to get up into Lake Superior, and those numbers were increasing dramatically every year of ship traffic. If you have more ship traffic, and you see this image right here, more ship traffic, statistically, there's going to be a side effect of that. More ships, you're going to have more shipwrecks. And I look at this picture right here, I love it. You know, I think most of us probably in this group watching or listening tonight are, you know, boat nerds, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And if we saw this many ships, you know, we still, as many of you are also probably aware, there's occasional problems with the Sioux Locks today. So we'll see a little backup in ship traffic. There's actually quite a few that went through the locks today. But if we saw this many ships, we would be going bananas. This would be pretty exciting for us to see this kind of ship traffic. But as I was saying, with more ship traffic, you're going to have more shipwrecks. Now, let's look specifically at one storm, which probably most people aren't completely aware of, that took place in late November of 1872. And if you take a look at this image that I'm showing right here, and what I'm going to demonstrate here is the need for what came to be the 4 original life-saving stations that were built along that stretch of shoreline from Whitefish Point to the area of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. If you take a look at this image right here, these are 2 schooner barges. The one on the left is called the Jupiter. The one on the right is actually called the Yankee, and the vessel just beyond them is a steamship that would be towing these 2 schooner barges. This was a pretty common practice once we got into a certain era. Some of these schooners were getting older, and then they would have their masts kind of cut down a little bit. They would still have the ability to put up sail, and they would still have a crew. They'd still have a captain, but they were often, and it was considered more commercially viable to move cargoes by having one steamship like the one you see on the right. That's the John A. Dix. That one is going to be a part of the story we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. And then in the upper left-hand picture, you can see the Jupiter again, and then you can also see the Saturn. There was another vessel called the Mars. These were all vessels, including the John Dicks, that were owned by Eber Brock Ward, a Detroit businessman that owned a number of ships. And they were coming out of Marquette. And the scene would have looked something like this on November the 26th, 1872. And if you read the newspaper articles of the day, the weather was perfect. It was lovely. The lake was placid. It was warm, very much like the way the descriptions were on November the 9th, 1975 in Superior, Wisconsin, when the Edmund Fitzgerald departed as it was heading, up across the lake and eventually, hopefully, going to get to Whitefish Bay. So on November the 26th, 1872, you have lovely, lovely weather. But, and as the John A. Dicks and the Jupiter and the Saturn departed Marquette, they had a load of iron ore for the lower lakes. They were headed for the Sioux Locks. That was going to be their first stop. Well, about 12 hours into their trip, the weather changed pretty dramatically to the point where they probably were getting worried very, very quickly by how quickly the weather can change. And I don't know if any of you, I'm sure many of you are boaters. You've been out on places like Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior. The weather can change so quickly. It really, and if you've been in the middle of it, it can be kind of scary sometimes. My wife and I like to go out and sea kayak quite a bit, and there have been a few times, and one in particular, where that weather changed just quickly enough, and it was blowing us offshore that we were a little bit concerned about getting actually back to the beach. And it just kind of, for me, demonstrated how quickly and scary that weather can be when it changes that quickly. But 12 hours into the trip with the John A. Dicks, the Jupiter, and the Saturn, these vessels, again, they're all carrying iron ore. They're headed east from Marquette. They're headed to the Sioux Locks, and the weather changed that quickly. At the Sioux Locks, we had an idea from the general superintendent of the St. Mary's Falls Ship Canal, basically the Sioux Locks, a guy by the name of Guy Carlton. He was interviewed by a newspaper reporter shortly after this big storm, and that reporter must have asked him, well, what was it like at the locks? And Carlton was able to respond, and this is a quote straight out of the newspaper, that it blew fearfully, accompanied with a blinding snowstorm and cold. One could scarcely look to the windward. It came from the westward, veering occasionally to the northwest. The water and ice were driven from the lake and river above into the canal at a fearful rate. The water rising completely over the lock gates, filling both locks to their utmost capacity and overflowing the canal banks. So think about that. Those winds and the water level was going up. The wind was blowing so dramatically that he would have a quote like that. And if you can just imagine for a moment, and I'm actually in Sault Ste. Marie right now, this is another area, and I'm going to step back for a minute. I think of people that I've talked to who remember what the weather conditions were like on November the 10th, 1975, when the Fitzgerald was out there and eventually sank. There were wind gusts that were recorded at 90 miles per hour at the Sioux Locks. So we don't know exactly how hard the wind was blowing that night in 1872, but it must have been pretty dramatic for this description that we see from Guy Carlton. And if that was the weather at the Sioux Locks, you can only imagine what it was actually out on the lake for these three vessels that were trying, and a number of other vessels out there that night trying to get to port and get to safety. If it was that bad at the locks, it would have looked something like this. This is not the Jupiter, it's not the Saturn, but it gives you an idea of the image of what it might have looked like. Because as you recall, I stated that the Jupiter and Saturn were being towed by the John A. Dicks, and they are towed by these heavy, what are called hawsers, these 3-inch or even thicker in some cases, ropes, heavy duty to basically be towing along these other ships. But these tow lines had the ability to snap, to part from the ships that are towing them. And when they did that, and part of the purpose of still keeping the ability to sail these vessels was to at least try to get in out of trouble. And the crew of the Jupiter and the crew of the Saturn, as soon as the captain of the Dicks saw that tow line had parted and both of them were off on their own at that point, literally those vessels disappeared and there were no survivors from either one of those, the Jupiter or the Saturn. They were both driven ashore. The Jupiter was driven ashore a few miles west of a place called Chris Point. There's a lighthouse there. I think many of you are probably familiar with that lighthouse. There was actually a life-saving station there before the lighthouse was built. But we're talking 1872. So at this point, we didn't have a lighthouse and we didn't have a life-saving station either. So the Jupiter was driven aground a few miles west of Chris Point, and then the Saturn eventually was driven aground a few miles west of Whitefish Point. And there were some individuals of those crew members that actually did survive, but there was nothing for them out there. They had no place to go. It's pretty remote out there now. It was far more remote even then. There were no life-saving stations or anything like that. So for those crew members that did survive and did get ashore, tragically enough, they died of exposure. There was nobody out there to help them. So we start to see that there might be reasons, it's not the right way to put it, but in many people's minds, after this storm in 1872, and there were 2 other shipwrecks that night with no survivors either. Another vessel called the W.O. Brown over on the Canadian side, and then another ship called the Charles Griswold. So you had 4 shipwrecks. And if you count the Dicks, which almost, they were in trouble by the time they were getting to Whitefish Bay, you could have had 5 shipwrecks in this one storm and a heavy loss of life. So a lot of people started to wonder, and possibly people like Eber Ward, that businessman that owned the Jupiter and the Saturn and the Dicks, would there be anything that could be done to try to help, help these crew members that might have gotten ashore, or even those that were still on the vessels as they were driven ashore? If let me go back a slide. If you look at this, and this is what it looked like at the height of the storm when the Jupiter and Saturn were driven ashore. In more recent years, this is what the Jupiter looks like. Again, the one that's just a little bit west of Chris Point. The sand shifts out there, and there's some years that we can see them. They're very shallow. We've kayaked over them before, and you can see these vessels below you. It's pretty interesting, but there's some years that the sand shifts and they're obscured or you can't see them. And here the Jupiter, very difficult to see as the sands come up and over it. So that's what it looks like more in recent years. And again, this was a very, very tragic situation that we're talking about with all of those shipwrecks. And storms like that, with that many ships getting into trouble, wasn't really as uncommon as you might think. Now, I'm looking at a historic image, and we're looking at a historic image of Whitefish Point in this slide. And that's very early on. We know it's between 1885 and 1903. A lighthouse keeper by the name of Charles Kimball was a real early photography buff, and he took a number of pictures of Whitefish Point. This was during his time at the point. And the reason I show this slide, and we come back to Whitefish Point, is the idea of these lighthouse keepers. Maybe they could help, right, with these different shipwrecks. The lighthouse itself was an aid to navigation and is an aid to navigation. So really the primary purpose of the lighthouse and those lighthouse keepers was to prevent shipwrecks. You know, Whitefish Point's lighthouse marks the entrance to Whitefish Bay, or for that ship traffic that's clearing Whitefish Point and heading out into the big lake. So all that ship traffic, as they got closer, coming in out of the big lake, they could see Whitefish Point, and in rough weather, they knew they were getting closer to Whitefish Bay and what would hopefully be calmer waters. So that was the purpose for that lighthouse there. But the purpose was not. The purpose was more to help prevent the wrecks, but there wasn't quite as much that these lighthouse keepers could do to rescue sailors that might be in distress, out on Lake Superior or any of the other lakes, so the East Coast, West Coast, so on and so forth. So what was the answer? Well, the answer came in the form of the United States Life-Saving Service. And this really, in a lot of ways, is what I might consider a forgotten part of maritime history, not just on the Great Lakes, but the East Coast, West Coast, like I was saying. And I think even the Mississippi River, or maybe it was the Ohio River, had a life-saving station as well. And so if you have the lighthouse service preventing shipwrecks, the United States Life-Saving Service was meant to aid those mariners and passengers on ships and humans that just simply got into trouble out on, in our case, Lake Superior. And so the Life-Saving Service is a predecessor to the United States Coast Guard, and it combined with a revenue cutter service in 1915 to create what we now call the Coast Guard. But their mission was, the Life-Saving Service, that is, was pretty direct. They were watching, in this case, Lake Superior and the lakes in general, and keeping an eye out for ships that might be in trouble. The origins of the United States Life-Saving Service in the United States can be a little bit muddled sometimes. You had volunteer stations that appeared on the East Coast going back as far as 1848. The Humane Society of Massachusetts, and that's not to do with cats and dogs, but more with Humane Society saving humanity in peril out of the high seas, that kind of thing. This is a station in Maine that you can see right here, but many of these early stations were volunteer operated. So if you think of like a volunteer fire department, and if there's a ship in distress, well, you've got to find these guys and get them, get them to their station, and then they need to get into all their gear, and then they need to get into their boats if that's what they're going to use, and go out and try to help those sailors that are in distress. So the volunteer situation was good. It was better than nothing, that's for sure. And certainly, if a ship was driven ashore and a crew got, safely to the shoreline, having a station there was a godsend in many cases. But it still wasn't really the best situation. It wasn't until 1871 when this man, Sumner Kimball, he was the general superintendent of the life-saving service, and he was the only one that they ever had from 1871 to the time when, as I said, 1915, when the Revenue Cutter Service and the Life-Saving Service combined to form the Coast Guard. The only individual that was in charge of the Life-Saving Service was this man, and he was absolutely the man for the job. He, if you read what it was like before 1871, before it really officially became the Life-Saving Service, things were maybe operated a little bit loosely without going into great detail. But he put an emphasis on the equipment, on hiring the right men, and in this case, it was all men. There were not women that were life-saving service crew members, unlike the Lighthouse service, where there were many women that were Lighthouse Keepers. You didn't see that with the life-saving service. There were certain characteristics that they were looking for, and some of these remote places, like the life-saving stations I'm going to talk about tonight, they didn't have a lot of people to choose from, but they couldn't be under a certain height. They couldn't be over 40 years old, if I remember correctly. They had be between 18 and 40, or maybe that was 45, but they couldn't be much older than that. They had to be good swimmers. They had to be able to handle boats, things like that. And many of those policies that restricted and looked for what were considered the best possible candidates came from this man, Sumner Kimball. Now, let's go back and take a look at the Shipwreck Coast right here. So again, Whitefish Point, where my cursor is, and then of course my cursor just disappears, but here it's back, and we head back to Munising, Grand Island, at the end of what we call the Shipwreck Coast. Originally in 1876, there were 4 stations that were built along that coastline. The first one was Vermillion. That was 12 miles west of Whitefish Point. 7 miles further west, you had Chris Point, and then about approximately the same distance for the next 2 stations, you had Two Hearted River that was next, and then the Deer Park Station, which was also called Muskellonge Lake. So if any of you have ever gone camping at that Muskellonge Lake State Campground that's up there, beautiful, beautiful location, that is on very close to where the site is. As a matter of fact, they've got a number of interpretive panels out there that tell the story of that life-saving station. So these 4 stations, they all had a very, very similar design. If you take a look at the station house right here for Vermilion, and then Chris Point, look at each one of them. They're identical. These were all built in 1876. They were operational by 1877. And if you take a look at this architectural schematic here, this elevation you can see, or these elevations, you can see the east elevation, and then you can see the north, and that's what faced the water. So if you looked at this building, it was pretty small, and you housed a crew of 6, as well as the keeper, the man that was in charge of the station, and his family. It was also a boathouse at the same time. So in the upper level, right about in this area, you had bunks for the crew members. In the front of the building up here where this window is, right in this area, that's where the keeper and his family would stay originally. I say originally because they expanded these stations, and in later years allowed the crew to build little cabins in some of the areas of these stations for their families. The boathouse is right here, kind of unusual. It came out of the side of the building essentially, so they'd have to move their surfboat out down to the water. From that, which could be a hull, those things were pretty heavy. And if you take a look right here, it gives you an idea of what they would have been doing. So this is further on from 1877. You can take a look, things have changed a little bit. We can see some additions to the building here. So if you take a look right here, and you take a look here, you can see a little gable end right there. And then you can see a lookout tower, which is a big part of keeping an eye on the water to see if any ships were in trouble. And if you take a look here, this is what's called a surfboat. We have one of these on exhibit at Whitefish Point, a reconstructed one that's in our surfboat house, and you can see they're probably doing kind of a demonstration for a journalist at this point. There's a lot of photographs that are about the same era. This is, I believe, right around 1907 in this picture. This is a keeper, again, the man in charge by the name of Carpenter and his crew. They have their summer weight uniforms on, they've got their cork life jackets on, and they're rolling that boat down to the shoreline. So there would be logs, it would be rollers, and almost like a ramp of sorts. So they would be practicing with these surf boats, and these surf boats were interesting in some ways. They were light, they were highly maneuverable. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them here in a minute. But you also see, this is something I like to point out in this picture, what looks like a very, very long oar. You can see that the keeper has right next to him right here. That's what's called a sweep. And that was about 12 feet long, actually longer than that. I can't remember exactly, think of the length, but they were very long, and it acted like a rudder. And the crew would face the keeper as they were pulling on those oars. This could be pretty dramatic. You know, I'm sure many of you have gone swimming in Lake Superior, and you know, even in the summer, it's really not that warm. And I'm going to show you a few images as we go on here that will give you an idea how challenging it might have been to effect a rescue with one of those surf boats. I use this slide too. Again, you can see the original station house here at Vermilion. And you can also see that there are a lot of what we might call civilians, basically families here with Keeper Carpenter. You can see right here, and his wife. You can see a dog here in the picture. This is 1907, presumably as well. And you can just see a little bit of a glimpse of family life here. So these were pretty lonely stations. If any of you have gone out to Vermilion now, there's really nothing out there. I love it for that reason. It's truly gorgeous out there, but it was even more remote back then. They didn't have four-wheel drives that you could take out there back in the day. So once you were out there and you arrived by water and you departed by water, you were out there. And if you had your family with you, if you were a surfman, as they called them, a life-saving service crew member, I'm sure your life was much better if you had your family out there. And they had various social activities they would have out at the station and things like that. So there's a book, and it's one of my favorites, and it tells the story of the Vermilion Life-Saving Station. It's called Life on a Lonely Shore, a history of the Vermilion Point Life-Saving Station. And it was written by Edward Canfield and Thomas Allen, both professors at Lake State University, but they both had a lot of connections with the Vermilion Station. And it does a very good job of describing what the work was like and what life was like for these people that lived out at stations like this. We'll move on to our surf boat here. So these things were about 26 feet long. You'll read varying lengths and weights for these boats, but typically around 26 feet long, right around 1,000, possibly 1,300 pounds these things weighed. They were self-bailing. And again, look at the summer uniforms here. They don't have their cork life vests on, so they're probably posing right there for the camera. But these boats were self-bailing, so if a wave crashed in, there were scuppers that would allow that water basically below the deck line that or actually slightly above, the water could escape and get out of the boat. Not quite as quickly as it would come in sometimes, but it would allow that water to escape. They were self-bailing, but they weren't self-righting, these boats. So if one of these got flipped over in a storm, and that was known to happen, the crew had to be trained to turn these things back over again. So this was quite a skill, and it was not an easy job, particularly when you look at this slide. This is Vermilion as well. We know it's past 1915 because if you look at the bow of that surf boat, it says U.S. Coast Guard at this point. So here they are out there. It's probably April, possibly May. You never know because the ice can hang around out on Lake Superior pretty late some years. But you can see Vermilion in the background. We can see some different buildings, maybe some cabins built by some of these life-saving service crew members for their families. But look at this picture and think about a boat drill where you turn your boat over and then you have to pull it back over again. I will say I've read one of those old, I've got a 1916 Coast Guard Blue Book, which gives detailed instructions on how these crew members were to act and what the training was and what the guy in charge of the station, what he would be able to do or not do. And if the weather was really bad or possibly a situation like this, they didn't always require these crews to flip these boats over. like you see in these pictures right here. This is at a place called Sand Point outside of Munising, and they would have competitions sometimes with these life-saving service crew members, or even in later years, the Coast Guard lifeboat station crew members. And one of the fastest ever was a crew out of Marquette, and under the command of a man named Henry Cleary. And Cleary was like a Superman when it comes to the life-saving service. He was so good at training his crew. He knew what he was doing. He seemingly made the right decisions at the right times. And he had his crew trained so well that they could roll that surf boat over and back up over again. And Cleary wouldn't even get his feet wet in the process. They could do it in about 13 seconds. So it's pretty amazing. And it was so important that they could do this as second nature, so they wouldn't have to be thinking about it. So that's why all the training came in. So let's take a look at this with the training they had. If you look at Monday, that was the beach apparatus. So I'm going to talk about this in a minute. It's a small cannon that had a projectile that would have a line attached, and you could rig up a system almost like a zip line where you could bring people off of a sinking ship. Tuesday was the boat training. That was what we just looked at in the previous slides, where they would train with rolling those surf boats over and getting them righted again and getting underway. Wednesday was signal practice. Think of flags being used for signaling. Think of the era that we're talking about. So we didn't have radio, so they'd be signaling ships and each other with flags. Beach apparatus, so we're back to that again. It's that little cannon called a Lyle gun. And then on Friday, practice of restoring the nearly drowned. So think of CPR in this case. So, and then Saturday was housekeeping, tidying up the station house or their little cabin if they had one that would be near the station. And then Sunday would be a day of rest. It's important to remember there weren't shipwrecks every day. The press of the day loved these life-saving service crewmen. They called them the heroes of the surf, the storm warriors. If you read these accounts, and they really were truly heroes because of what they were doing. They were putting their lives on the line to go out and rescue their fellow human beings that might be on a ship that's about to sink. And the life-saving service and really Coast Guard in certain eras had a motto: you have to go out, nothing says you have to come back. And that was really kind of their motto. They had to go out to try to rescue people on these ships that were sinking, a very noble cause. But in some cases, those crews didn't come back. So it was clearly dangerous work, no question about it. Now, we talked about the beach apparatus, and there was what was called a Lyle gun. Small cannon, you can see right here. This is called a beach cart. And the crew, in some cases, not all cases, sometimes they had horses that would pull these beach carts along, but in many cases, you had what was called Norwegian steam. Basically, these crew members were the horses in this case, and they'd be pulling these heavy 1,300-pound plus beach carts when you had all the equipment on board, and they'd be pulling these things through the sand to get to where a ship might have been driven ashore. And typically, and not typically, that would be when they'd be using a Lyle gun, as you see right here. So basically, if you're within about 500 yards, a ship has been driven ashore, and probably the effective range of this Lyle gun was closer to 200, possibly 300 yards, because what's happening is you're shooting this projectile you see right here, which weighed about 17 pounds, had a line attached to it. That little part right there would be facing out of the muzzle, and as it was fired from this cannon, that projectile would kind of straighten out, and that what was called a whip line, so you had a rope attached to it, would be following it. And if you take a look at this image right here, you can see a practice session with what's called a drill pole right there. There's the projectile, there's the line, so they had to practice, as I was saying, with these things. So it was second nature. If you take a look at this next image, you can see an artist's conception of what this would have looked like. Look at that big, what is very likely an ocean-going vessel. It's been driven ashore in a dramatic storm, and you can just make out the line that's going out to the ship, and you could see a person there suspended from what's called a breechs buoy. It was like a life jacket with canvas pants sewn into it, or not a life jacket, but a life ring. And a person would step down into that, and you can kind of get a view of what this would have looked like right here in this center bottom illustration. You can see the person being suspended from a heavy line, another hawser right there. Or look at this above image. You can see somebody being rescued right there and a schooner having been driven ashore. So there were a series of lines, and it can be very complicated, but they had a light line that was fired out first. The crew on the ship, if they had their wits about them, would pull that line in. Often it would end up in the rigging, and then they would tie that line off. They would pull in rather a heavier rope, a hawser, and then you had another line that was being used. And so what you ended up having was the hawser that would suspend. You see in figure 3 here. The breechs buoy, as I just described. So there's your life ring and those little short pants, and the person would step down into it. And one person at a time, possibly two, but I think that's kind of hard to imagine. If you look at one of these, maybe a child could be held in somebody's arms. Think of how dramatic this would have been if you consider that the wind and the weather was dramatic enough to push or drive a ship around ashore. Very high winds, sand blowing, the wind so loud that you probably wouldn't be able to hear over the wind. So these are tough conditions to be working in, but these life-saving service crew members did it time and time again, saved thousands of lives in the process. The other image I'm going to show you in this slide, this is what's called a Francis metallic life car. This worked on the same principle as the breechs buoy, only this was like a little boat that was enclosed, like a little lifeboat, and people could crawl into these things. They would seal up the hatch and they'd bring the whole thing over, so you could move more people from the boat to the shoreline, that quickly. Now, we had one on exhibit for a few years at the Shipwreck Museum, and I've seen accounts where it said you could put 12 people in one of these. I don't see how that is possible at all. These things are so small. And the thing to consider is when the hatch was closed up, they were considered, at least the early versions would have been airtight. Some of them had perforations in them, but if you get into one of these, it would probably definitely be a better situation than staying on your ship that's about to break up, but you would also want to make sure, you would hope anyways, that life-saving service crew knew what they were doing as they brought your life car with you in it and possibly your family. You're getting beaten around inside of this thing on the way to the shoreline. A couple other slides I'm going to show you too that just demonstrate some of the work of the life-saving service. Beach patrol, you can see here on the left, probably one of the most important aspects of what that life-saving service crew would do. They would be walking, and if you look at Vermilion as an example, they would go 4 miles one way on patrol, turn around and come back to the station. So 8 miles that they would be doing on their patrol. On a lovely, summer evening, that might be kind of nice. But if it's the shipping is going into late November, early December, conditions like we have out here as I look out of the window right now, that would be pretty rough. And in the spring, it would be cold. You'd have sand being blown into your eyes when high winds are blowing. In some of the early years, you had accounts of wolves causing problems for some of these lifesavers. So it could be a tough job for sure. And if you think of the gear they were wearing, it wasn't Gore-Tex, wasn't breathable, oil skins, the boots you can see on this gentleman on the left, he's got his light right there. And they also carried, and you can see some of these around him, what were called Coston flares. So if a ship had run aground and they were sending off their signals to say, hey, to anybody who could see me, I'm in trouble. Well, these life-saving service crew members had these Coston flares they could set off. It was a handheld flare, and that would signal to the ship in distress that help was on the way. And then, of course, up in the lookout towers, this is Vermilion as well, and they would just keep a close eye on the water itself. A couple more slides here, Vermilion. For those of you who are familiar with that old station, and here's what that station house pretty much looks like today. That is the last one of its kind of those 4 original Lake Superior type stations. So here's what it looked like 1907, and this is what it looks like for the most part right now. And you see in the lower left-hand image, there is a nonprofit group, kind of a grassroots effort to rescue, to ultimately at first stabilize this structure and then eventually restore it to have it used as more of maybe a part-time visitor center to occasionally tell the story of the life-saving service in this station. And I also have to point out that the property that Vermilion is on is owned by Little Traverse Conservancy. And so in 2017, these groups came together, SOS Vermilion and Little Traverse Conservancy, and LTC as it's called. Little Traverse Conservancy has been great to work with. I'm part of this SOS Vermilion group. So if you're curious to learn more about that group, you can just Google it. It's easier to Google SOS Vermilion. And we don't want to get that confused with the Vermilion. Carrie and I were talking about this earlier, where the museum was before the National Museum of the Great Lakes. So this is our Vermilion. I don't know if the Vermilion down there on Lake Erie has 2 L's. but ours has one, Vermilion. And it's just a lonely little place now for the last one, and we're trying to save it. So let's shift gears, and I want to talk about a shipwreck that occurred, and I'm going to make this one relatively quick to summarize what happened with this particular vessel. And this was kind of an unusual shipwreck in some ways. This is the Thephines Marsh, and it is a vessel that got into trouble in August in the 1890s. So this is after these stations had been built, and this vessel was carrying sandstone, and it was headed downbound as well. And what ended up happening was a summer storm, not super common, but not unheard of, came in out of the northwest, and the captain of this schooner, the Marsh, knew that his ship was in trouble. He was getting driven ashore. There was really nothing they could do about it. Their vessel was also taking on water. And so they were near Crisp Point, just a few miles west of Crisp Point. And at this point, you did have that life-saving station there. The Marsh did end up being run aground, and very lucky for the crew and the captain on board the Marsh, there was a life-saving service crewman on beach patrol nearby. They had sent up flares. The captain of the Marsh sent his crew up into the rigging and wait out whatever was going to happen. But luckily for them, they were seen by that surfman. He took his Coston flyer out, lit that up, and that not only let the crew on the Marsh know that they had been seen and help was on the way, but it also that flare was seen at Crisp Point itself. So the man on the lookout was able to see that, and they knew something was happening, and they were able to launch their surf boat. So this was far enough offshore that they weren't going to be using that beach apparatus and the Lyle gun in this rescue. But to get beyond the breakers, it took them a mile on pulling on the oars on that surf boat, and then they had to turn and head into the direction of the Thephines Marsh. They had another 5 miles of pulling on those oars before they got to the ship, which at that point started heeling over. Some of the people fell out of the rigging. The crew had tried to launch their yawl or their lifeboat, basically the Marsh, but that got smashed as soon as they tried to get it into the water, smashed up against the hull. And really, I'm sure that the crew at that point saw the arrival of this little surf boat as nothing less than a miracle, as Captain Small was the keeper in charge of the Crisp Point station, maneuvered his little surf boat in close enough to start getting the people in out of the water. And before that ship heeled over and went straight to the bottom, they were able to get most of the crew off when it did go to the bottom. Some of them, including a woman who was the cook, were caught up in the rigging and some of the wreckage from that ship, but they were able to pluck them out of the water. And again, dramatic conditions, but get everybody into the surf boat and start pulling for the shore. Now their next big challenge was to get everybody safely onto the beach, because when you've got that those following seas coming behind you, when you're trying to get up onto the shoreline, it's a real skill to do that. But that was something that they trained for, and they did end up rescuing the entire crew on board the Thephines Marsh. This is what the Marsh looks like today, relatively shallow wreck as well, but again, this one's a little bit west of Crisp Point. And so if that's what it looks like on a summer day, if you're a scuba diver, well, again, this is what it looked like when she was in her glory. We know a lot about these various rescues because we do a lot of research, but one of the best books, one of the best sets of books that you can look at to research these rescues would be the reports of the United States Life-Saving Service to Congress, which would talk about everything from their expenditures. Again, there was a bit of a bureaucracy that was going into this particular arm, this federal undertaking. But they talked about the rescues. They talked about such things as the expenditures. They would talk about some of the inventions that were being reviewed by the Life-Saving Service that might be used in rescues. They're fascinating books, and you can often find, if you're looking for a specific shipwreck where you knew a rescue took place, you can often find that information in one of these reports. So I think many of these are online as well. You could Google U.S. Life-Saving Service reports, and I think you could find those. We're fortunate at the Shipwreck Museum that we have a full set of these reports, and they really help us in our research. Now, let's shift gears here again for a minute. I'm going to talk about the Nelson. And if you take a look at this image right here, I showed you this one before. The Nelson was a barkentine that It was sailing as of 1866, built in Milwaukee, and sailed for 3 decades with a number of accidents, admittedly. But it was in 1899 when things really kind of turned, well, didn't go in a good way for the Nelson. And this is a wreck that we discovered, and I say we, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. We still have an active underwater research program, and we have a research vessel that we take out in the summer, and we have a sonar that we tow, and we can see the bottom of the lake. The sonar we have is it's one built by a company called Marine Sonic Technology out of Yorktown, Virginia, and we've gotten it dialed in this year, and it is just excellent. You can see images of these ships on the bottom of the lake. The Nelson, as I said earlier, we found in 2014, but this is an example of a shipwreck that took place where the life-saving service, just by virtue of being there, not necessarily a heroic rescue, but by having these stations out there on that shoreline, helped make the difference, at least for one member of this crew. And the Nelson, like some of these other vessels, the Jupiter and Saturn that I talked about, was by the time we get to 1899, it was a schooner barge. And if you take a look, that vessel right here on the right, that's the Nelson. And this is another schooner barge by the name of the Mary B. Mitchell. And here's a steamer called the A. Folsom. This trio was a regular sight going off of Whitefish Point. And here's another view of the Folsom. It's one of those lumber hookers. Look at all that stacked lumber you can see in the background. And they're loading up the decks, but it did double duty by pulling these other vessels as well. And this was May of 1899. So we talked about November 1872. We talked about August of 1896. But the Marsh, and now we're going to talk about May of 1899. So it really tells you these storms could come at any time of the year. And this would have been a view similar to what the captain of the Folsom, a man by the name of White, Captain A.E. White of the Folsom, if he would have been looking back and seeing the Mary B. Mitchell and the Nelson, and they were based out of Bay City, part of the Mitchell Transportation Company, he would have had a view that would have looked something like this. But they were upbound. They were headed to a place called Lake Linden in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And after they left the Sioux Locks under, again, very nice weather conditions, they turned and went past Whitefish Point. Probably, could see the Lighthouse Keeper up there in the tower as they're heading out into the big lake. And a few hours later, that weather turned very, very dramatically and looked something probably like this. And Captain White on board the Folsom, and you can read this, part of it's blocked for me, but he related that the wind blew 50 miles an hour from the northwest and it was freezing cold. The seas froze over everything when they broke aboard and everything became covered with ice. Early yesterday afternoon, the wind and the sea became too severe to steam into any longer, and I determined to put the tow about and run back. I was watching the barges and I saw the Mitchell make the turn successfully. The Nelson hung a little, and soon the space between her and the Mitchell widened. It was certain that the tow line had parted. So think about Captain White in his pilot house, terrible condition. The wind is howling. There's ice building up on his ship. He probably had his binoculars or telescope. He's looking back at those other ships as they start to make the turn. He probably breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief when Mitchell made the turn, but then the Nelson, he was watching it, and that tow line, he knew it had parted. He went on to say the Nelson turned toward, because after he knew, I'm going to step back for a second, after he knew that tow line had parted, he went on to say, after he was interviewed, that Nelson turned toward the shoreline, and I think her captain intended to beach her. I had supposed that she was in good shape as they had made no signals. Before we were aware, and I've got these things blocking, I can only read part of this. She began sinking. In a few minutes, she dove to the bottom. The crew did not even have time to lower their yawl. Not a piece of wreckage was left to mark the spot, and the Nelson disappeared as quickly as one could snuff out a candle. I'm adding a few words in there from memory because part of my screen has that blocked, but you get the picture. As far as Captain White was concerned, he saw that Nelson turn. They being the crew and the captain, a man by the name of Haggany on board the Nelson, they probably tried a little bit to save their vessel, but Captain White couldn't see that. He just saw the Nelson sink that quickly. That had to be kind of tough, very difficult to take, because all these crews, they knew each other. They worked together, probably for years. So he saw that ship sink. What he couldn't see at that time was Captain Andrew Haggerty on board the Nelson, tried to rally his crew. They tried to raise sail. In the end, they knew they had more water in their hold that they could deal with. The waves were sweeping over the top of that schooner barge at that point, so they had to take drastic action. And in this case, and if you look at the right-hand side there of this artist's conception, Robert McGreevy was the artist in this case, did an excellent job, I think, of portraying what those final moments of the Nelson might have looked like. But they launched their lifeboat, and Captain Haggerty had a crew of about 6, some accounts say 7, but he also had his wife and child on board as well. And you can see here, Robert McGreevy captured what could be the image of what was happening just in the final moments. The lifeboat is there. You've got the crew on board, Captain Haggerty now. Someone had to stay on board, so he lowered from the davits. And you take a look. Note a couple of things you see in this image. Note the cabin here, the ship's wheel. Here are the davits. There's a tow bit right there. The heavy lines to be attached if there would have been another vessel being towed. And then part of a capstan you can see right above Captain Haggerty's head right there. But what was happening and what is happening in this picture is Captain Haggerty had lowered the lifeboat, and the only way now, they had to keep a line attached to it or it would have gotten away before he could get on board. But he had to crawl over the side of the stern of his vessel, let go of his grip, fall down into the water. And as soon as he did that, and as soon as he surfaced, he saw the stern of his ship go up in the air. And the most tragic part of this is the line was still attached to that lifeboat, and that stern went up in the air and that ship dove for the bottom. It's in over 250 feet of water at this point, just off Grand Marais. But sadly enough, that lifeboat that had his crew, his friends, his wife, his child on board, it took that lifeboat right with it, and nobody was ever found. They didn't recover anybody after that. The Deer Park station was close by, and they didn't know what was happening. The Nelson was far enough offshore, but Captain Haggerty ended up being the only survivor from the shipwreck. And by virtue of this station being there, he was able to get to the shoreline probably in a state of shock, let alone from the freezing cold water in May in 1899, but also knowing that his wife and child were gone. His wife was the cook. I think in some ways maybe it made sense that they had their child with them, and his crewmates were gone as well. So he was able to start staggering and walking very slowly, probably crawling at some points towards this Deer Park station, where one of the crewmen that was on beach patrol found him, and they took him back. Took him back to the station. They gave him stimulants. They warmed him up. They, at that point, immediately went out searching for survivors, which unfortunately they didn't find any. Now, let's skip forward a minute. We're going to go to 2014. And this is the Nelson, as I said, just off in the vicinity of Grand Marais. And some of those parts of the ship that I said look for, this big, massive gap you see right here is where that ship's cabin was. That blew off as the ship went to the bottom, and that's probably what Captain Haggerty was able to get a hold of. And that's what helped him to survive as he maybe got up out of the water a little bit and get to the shoreline. There you can see the ship's wheel. You can see those tow bits. There's a capstan right there. This is the stern. You can see the vessel, and then you can see part of a mast right there. There's another image of the ship's wheel, which for that ship going to the depth that it did, isn't in bad shape. There you can see just materializing the back of those tow bits, and then the capstan and part of the mast right there. There's the coal you can see. That was part of that cargo that was on its way to the Keweenaw Peninsula. Here you can see what's called a cat head that the anchor would hang off of, and the anchor in really good shape right there. And there you can see the name. You are not always so lucky to have a name that clear. And so again, that image was taken from our ROV, our little remotely operated vehicle we have in 2014. And you don't have any zebra mussels or anything like that. We can still see green paint on the decks. So it's pretty amazing at this point. Now, I'm going to shift gears because I know we're running out of time. We're going to go back to Whitefish Point. And at this point, I'm going to reference the fact that we never did have a life-saving station at Whitefish Point. Obviously, as you can see in the picture, this is another Charles Kimball photo. This is his wife and child. You can see right there, Addie Kimball and their daughter, Marguerite. And you can see Whitefish Point. Obviously, a light station, but no life-saving station. So what did they have? Well, Whitefish Point had what was called, and came to be known in later years, as a Coast Guard lifeboat station. And it was really the same thing as the life-saving service, but a little bit of a different era. In many cases, they were using much of the same technology. I love this picture because it shows you how much Whitefish Point has changed. And we know that this picture is probably, well, it's between 1923 and 1935, because the lifeboat station buildings, and this is a motor lifeboat house. Here you can see the cruise quarters from that station. Those buildings are up there at Whitefish Point. There's the lookout tower. But we know it's not beyond 1935 because that fog signal building is still standing. That was destroyed in the storm in 1935. So it shows you really how busy Whitefish Point was at that stage. And for those of you who have been up there, it looks quite a bit different today. This is a picture taken, same era that we're talking about. This was taken from the tower. And you can see some ship traffic passing. There's the surfboat house, which would have launched surfboats like I showed you before. You can see the cruise quarters, the lookout tower. So you had many of the same tools that they would have used to keep an eye on that ship traffic. But you can also see the nature of ship traffic was changing at that point too. We had more of these big steel steamers now that had pretty dramatic horsepower in some cases. Some of them were kind of underpowered, but still better off than maybe a schooner or a small, possibly underpowered steamer pulling 2 or 3 schooner barges, that kind of thing. So times were changing a little bit. Here's another view you can see. This is one of my favorite images. You can see the motor lifeboat house. There's a motor lifeboat right there. And you can see a tender pulling up. There's a drill pole, but a lighthouse tender bringing in food and supplies for the light station, the lighthouse keepers that were there at Whitefish Point. Just a few more images. You can see that motor lifeboat house again right there. The lighthouse in the background, the cruise quarters, and then we can see, I'm going to show you a few images of historic images combined with what we have today. There's the crew that would have been training. There's snow on the back, the stern there of the surfboat. You can see snow up on the roof. They're bundled up. They had to train in the cold, and we have obviously a lot of cold conditions up here in the UP. This is the reconstructed surfboat we have inside our surfboat house, where we have exhibits about those original 4 stations that were on the Shipwreck Coast. Here's a historic image of the surfboat house right after it was constructed, summer of 1922. You got the Roaring 20s up here at Whitefish Point. 1923, this thing is about to open. That's what it looks like today. So it's restored, and I just showed you that surfboat house, surfboat on the inside. This image, you can see the motor lifeboat house, also built 22 and operational by 1923. You can see part of a drill pole, so they were still using the Lyle guns and the breechs buoy to train with in that image. And here's what it looked like in 2013 as we were towing it back to Whitefish Point. In the early 1950s, these buildings were sold off by the Coast Guard as being redundant, surplus property, and an area fisherman and his family bought it to store fishing nets. So it was about not even really a mile down the road. We were able to bring it back in 2013, and this is what it looks like today. We're going to be opening that building up next year, and it's going to be our theater. So what was originally a U.S. Navy building, where most of you have probably seen our theater program, will now be taking place in that structure. Now, if you have a motor lifeboat house, you also have to have a motor lifeboat. And if you look at these images right here, particularly this one, that is a Type TR Coast Guard motor lifeboat, and each one of these had a number. This one is 36371. And then here you can see another image of 36371 with a surfboat. That's the motor lifeboat house there. Look at the rails that they would ride on carriages. They would launch them down into the water off of these carriages. And there you can see a surfboat again. This is down where the harbor is, just south of Whitefish Point. This is a Type H motor lifeboat. This was up at Whitefish Point as well. And so this was a predecessor to the one that we have, which you can see in this picture right here. So this is 36371. And then here's the one that we had donated to us, of all things, out in Maryland. There was a motor lifeboat called 36381. A gentleman by the name of Dave Sutton came forward. His father was in the Coast Guard. Felt very strongly about this history being preserved. So he donated the cost of this boat being purchased by the Shipwreck Museum. And then it was transported, and the transport company, we were so fortunate, donated the cost and all the different fees that they accrued to get the boat from Maryland all the way to the UP. And this is what it's looked like at a place called Murtaugh Boatworks in Hessel. If any of you are familiar with the antique boat show that takes place there every August, they have been restoring our lifeboat. There you can see a few images of the work taking place. And then this is what it looked like this past summer, just at the antique boat show as well. It's not done yet, but with any luck, it's going to be done and be put into that motor lifeboat house by this summer coming up. Now, a couple more slides and be wrapping the whole thing up. We're very fortunate, and we have a lot of work to do to better understand that history of the Coast Guard Lifeboat Station that truly is a part of that history of saving lives off the Shipwreck Coast. We're fortunate because I had contacted the National Archives in Chicago to ask if they had any materials related to the motor lifeboat station that we would have had there. And the gentleman on the other end of the line was already aware of this, and he apparently was aware of all the boxes of ledgers that they have that come straight from Whitefish Point. So we're going to be getting these ledgers, and it's going to tell us about the various, mostly daily life, the various occurrences, but really the daily life of this station and the various rescues. I spent 3 days at those National Archives, obviously before the pandemic, and I barely got through, I don't know how many of these ledgers, but not many of them, because there was a lot of interesting information. Much of it is very basic. Much of it is telling what their daily work was, telephone checks, the various drills. Again, this is Coast Guard we're talking about. But there's other interesting things. The training with the beach apparatus. There was an airplane that crashed nearby that they had to rescue the crew. So you really learn about a lot about these various stations, and in our case, luckily Whitefish Point, and then the crews that were coming in, so on and so forth. So if you put all this together, and it's a big part of what we do at the Shipwreck Museum, you get an interesting combination of that commerce that came through the shipping, and then ultimately the shipwrecks and the different reasons why these ships were getting into trouble. You get a good feel for what the lighthouse service was doing, those different lighthouse keepers, and some of the rescues that they participated in. And there was one that was off of Whitefish Point, a keeper by the name of Carlson. He rescued a crew off of a small steam fish tug that sank off of Whitefish Point. You learn those stories, but for this particular program, we focused in what we do in the Surfboat House and what we will do in the Motor Lifeboat House at Whitefish Point is focus on the rescues by the LifeSaving service and those 4 original stations, and then what ended up happening at Whitefish Point with that lifeboat station that started and was constructed in 22 and operational by 1923. So with that, I hope that you've gained an understanding of maybe some of the drama that took place just right off of the beaches of those areas up there in Lake Superior. I hope you enjoyed the program, and I know there's going to be some questions, and I think I went a little longer than I was anticipating, but I see Carrie coming back on here, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay. Well, yes, we have a few. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Bruce, then we can just talk a little bit if you want.
I will do that. And let me quick point out shipwreckmuseum.com. That's my marketing right there. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can visit that site, shipwreckmuseum.com. So I will stop sharing and we'll get to those questions here.
All right. Thank you so much, Bruce. We have had quite a number come in during. An anonymous attendee wanted to know how many lifesavers lost their lives before and then after the U.S. Coast Guard took over.
That's a really good question. And I don't know if that's one I could just answer off the top of my head. One thing you have to keep in mind is, and if we're asking about the lifesavers losing their lives, Vermilion, just as an example, they had a rescue that took place. It took place almost, I think, a little less than a year after that station was first opened up. And I think it was almost it might have been another 6 years, another 8 years before they actually had another rescue attempt. So it's kind of tough to break that down. I am not aware of any of those Vermilion lifesavers losing their lives, but I know down in Lake Huron, there was a station where I think a whole crew lost their lives. And so that could be a research subject just unto itself as to how many of the lifesavers lost their lives. But there were a number of them that did, and in some cases, a whole crew would be lost. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but it wasn't probably as common as a person would think, because again, there wasn't a shipwreck every day. So.
Right. Here's a question from Tom about the life cars. I'm wondering, and just if you know this or not, he's not, it's not a question, it's sort of, sorry, it's a statement. There is one of the life cars on display at Mariners Museum in Virginia. And just as another, our lifeboat that we have at the National Museum of the Great Lakes is a Joseph Francis Surf lifeboat, which is, I think, different than all of the boats you were talking about, but it is definitely not lightweight.
Well, you know, this one isn't either. That life cars is not. But there's a gentleman by the name of Jeff Shook that has one, and it was actually, here's a funny backstory. It was used. There were tourist cabins near Marquette, and someone found this discarded life car, and who knows, they sold it off to somebody else, and it probably sat in somebody's yard for a long time, and then it became part of a sign advertising these tourist court cabins. Well, somehow Jeff Shook found out about this, got it, restored it, and he rotates it between museums. So we share it with other museums, and when we have it on display, everybody loves this thing because you can step up on a little step, you can look down inside of it and see how small the thing actually was. To I don't know, I can't even imagine hardly crawling into it. But yeah, they weren't comfortable, but I suppose if your life was saved in the process, that was a better alternative.
Okay, let's see. I've got one question coming in from Toledo Live. So Ellen, if you want to turn that on and ask.
Let me unmute.
There you go.
Okay, Whitefish Point, I see 2, maybe 3 towers, a couple 100 feet towers. Was that radio towers? Because I know the Whitefish Point, they're not there anymore, obviously.
You're right. So they're not there. You can still see the foundation for one of them right at our little cul-de-sac. But there were 2 weather towers that were there. One was a weather tower. I'm sorry, one was a radio tower, but the other 2 were weather towers. So after a certain year, and I don't know exactly what year that was, they did have radio up there as well. But the 2 others that were a little shorter you saw were weather towers.
Was that Morse code or just voice?
You mean for the radio?
For the radio, yeah.
I think it was probably voice. That would be my guess.
Okay, excellent. From Dan Cornelli, he mentioned that, you know, we got a glimpse of those logs, but actually how many hours a day were spent on those drills that they were doing every day?
So it depends on the drill that they were doing. And you had part of the crew would still be out on beach patrol. The other crew, you know, some of the crew would actually be up at the lookout tower. Some of the training was shorter than the others. If you were doing the resuscitating the apparently drowned, I don't think that they spent a whole lot of, you know, they might have been out there getting each crew member a chance for a few hours a day, that kind of thing. Being out on the surf boat would be longer, of course, depending on the conditions. They really didn't want to lose these crew members, even though rough weather was the best training ground for them, but they also didn't want to kill them off before they actually had a chance to go out and rescue someone. So really depending on what it was, if you were doing the semaphore, the flag practice and things like that, and like I said, that equivalent of CPR, those were a little quicker just by the descriptions that I read. And then of course there were some days that they were, you know, Saturday they were doing housekeeping and things like that. So,
yep.
So just depending on which one they were doing.
Okay. One thing I will tell everybody that's on, Corey sent me a link to all of the U.S. LifeSaving reports, service reports that are digitized. So when I send out our wrap-up email with the link to Bruce's presentation, I will include that link to all of those U.S. LifeSaving service reports. So that if you have an interest, you can look into that. Neil was wondering, understanding the intensity of storms blowing up on Lake Superior, have any ships been lost in the St. Mary's River?
Yes, but not for the weather reasons so much. You know, the Independence, if you might recall early in the program, that's a good example of one, and that one wasn't even out of the St. Mary's River, the upper river, before it got out of the Whitefish Bay. But I had that boiler explosion. You did have occasions where collision took place. It could get very foggy, and some of those ships didn't slow down. So yeah, there were some occasions, and the Independence is a good example.
Okay. Oh, somebody wanted to know, and this is a question for you, and maybe we can bring it up with some other people that we all commonly know, wanting to know if some of those logs that you found are going to be transcribed and digitized.
I would say eventually, yes. There are so many of them, so we're going to have to spend some time going through them. But eventually, that would be a goal. And in a lot of the archives, we have a ways to go at the Shipwreck Museum where that kind of thing, goes. So we have a long way to go, but eventually, I would like to see that. And I was going to point out something too, that the gentleman, Carrie, you had just mentioned, had said that they were online, the LifeSaving service reports. But another great source of information, if you want to learn more about the life-saving service, would be the Life-Saving Service Heritage Association.
Okay.
So I don't remember exactly their website off the top of my head, but again,
I'll
if
look
you
it up
Google,
and add it in.
there you go. Yep, the Life-Saving Service Heritage Association, they're dedicated to this part of American history, and they do a fantastic job. They put on a conference every year.
Right.
Publication is excellent. So yeah, that'd be another good one.
Excellent. And the other thing I was going to add into that, there's a lot of people outside of museums that are just personally interested in this, that are finding these logs and starting to transcribe and digitize them. Again, I know it's a very slow process. A lot of them are up on, I can't come up with Walter's site, but a site, they just did a bunch of custom houses up at Mackinac Island. And then, so I would assume, at some point, yeah, we're going to get around to doing as many logs as we can find. Neil asked, your underwater search equipment is wonderful. How many vessels have your crews found and identified? And I just want to add on to this, how stupid jealous I am of your conditions. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't like cold water. But A, you can see, and B, there's no mussels. I'm just like, oh, it's not fair. But anyway, but
well,
back to
you know what?
question, which is how many vessels have you found?
If it's any consolation, Carrie, I'm jealous too, because half the time, summer is our busiest time of the year. So it's hard for me to get out on that research boat. We have a captain, we have a crew, and they're out there a lot. But, I'll give you an example. This year was highly unusual. We actually found 9 shipwrecks this year. Wow. We may have actually found more because our director of marine operations, a guy by the name of Daryl Ertel, right now is down in Florida, nice place to be, and he's reviewing sonar imagery at this point. And we're still going through all the ROV footage to positively identify a lot of these wrecks. But the organization itself, the Shipwreck Society, was more based on that underwater research. That's how it started. 1978, and then when some of the laws came into the state of Michigan that made it more of a unlawful act, right, to remove things from the ships. For the Shipwreck Society at that point became more documentation, and a lot of those artifacts that they had pulled up in the past, which a lot of people were doing, were placed in the museum. The state of Michigan worked out an arrangement where those could be on exhibit at that point. But to answer the question of how many, it's not a common thing. 2014, we found the Nelson, and then 2018, we found a ship called the SR Kirby, which is in over 800 feet of water just off the Keweenaw Peninsula, off Eagle River in that area. So every few years we were finding them, but this year we had this kind of amazing combination of perfect weather. We were searching in, I guess, what you would call a target-rich environment, which we were hoping it would be, but those shipwrecks aren't always, as Carrie knows, they're not always where those survivors would say, oh, it sank 3 miles northwest of Grand Marais, and you find the ship 20 miles away, kind of thing. So they're not always where people thought they would be. But between searching the shipping lanes, having really that marine sonic technology sonar dialed in to where it works so well, and a lot of support from that company, and having a consistent crew, we really were able to cover a lot of territory this year. So it worked out well. And that's probably one of the most exciting but least visible parts of what we do. So yeah, I enjoy when I can get out there, but I'm like you, Carrie. I'm jealous whenever that thing leaves the dock and I'm not with it. So.
So just a couple more, and we'll get finished up and let you get back to your evening. From Pat Ligabelle, which I would assume is Ted's wife.
That's right.
It was an excellent presentation. And they want to know what are the current efforts now at that Vermilion Life Saving Service building? Like where do you stand with how it's going?
So here's what's happening with that. Pat, that's a great question, and hi to Pat and Ted. I've known Pat and Ted for a long time, although I haven't seen you for a long time either. But to go back to SOS Vermillion, what it is right now is raising money. That's one of the biggest things that we're doing. And each year we'll do a little bit of work to keep it as much as possible stabilized. That building is really so invisible in some respects, meaning that Vermilion is hard to get to. A lot of people won't even consider trying to get out there. Although in recent years, more of the ATVs and side-by-sides have been going out there, that kind of thing. That's mostly good. In some cases, maybe not. But the visibility is low on that. So raising the awareness is a really big challenge for that particular organization. But for the last few years, it's been a lot of fundraising, working with Little Traverse Conservancy, and stabilization work. The other thing we did too is we're trying to get it back to the original footprint of that 1876 station, because a lot of those additions that were hammered onto the side of that building have actually caused a little stress on the original part of the structure. So working a little bit with the State Historic Preservation Office on that, we have been able to remove those sections, and we're just getting it back to that original footprint. And again, the main goal will be to stabilize it, but eventually lift it, get a foundation of sorts. I've actually walked up onto the second floor of that. It's not anything I'd recommend to anybody, but a few of us had to get up there just to see what, if anything, would have been up there. The other side, interesting thing, I know I'm getting long-winded here, but that building has an interesting history. And right after World War II, the Coast Guard basically called those buildings surplus property. For the most part, they abandoned them, even though they were meant to be used if in another emergency, or if they felt like they needed those buildings again, that they could reactivate them. But what ended up happening shortly after that is that there was a lot of vandalism. Some people, broke windows and kicked in doors and got inside and pretty much took a lot of the contents. And over the years, people have donated things that they had gotten out of those buildings. And I'll give you a good example. There was a lady who was, shortly after the Korean War wrapped up, her and her husband took their honeymoon. They went up to that area, which that alone surprised me because, think about the early 50s, what was up in paradise at that point. But they were able to get into a Jeep with an old gentleman. He took them out to what he called an old lighthouse. There was never a lighthouse out there, but he took them out to the old life-saving station. They walked around the buildings, and this lady found all these papers inside drawers of desks and things like that. And just as a little souvenir, she grabbed about a dozen of these papers that were enlistment papers for life-saving service, Coast Guard crew members. Some of the documents, but there were still some of the life-saving service documents there, and she just donated them to the museum this year. So, meaning the Shipwreck Museum in this case, not SOS Vermillion, but we've scanned them and we'll let SOS Vermillion have them. But so a lot of the history is out there. But Pat, to answer your question, I think it's going to be a long road at this point, and it's just a lot of fundraising to get this thing to the point where we can get it on a foundation and do more of the preservation work after that.
I will say that I was fortunate enough to go out there 2-3 years ago when the museum hosted the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History, and Bruce took a chunk of us out. I did say, "Oh, I can drive," and then they looked at my tiny little car and said, "Oh, we'll take the SUVs instead." So it is a beautiful location, and the history is really fascinating if you ever get a chance to go out there. I left this one for last because it's a great closing for you, which is the Shipwreck Museum open year round?
Unfortunately, we're not. So we closed at the end of October, and then we'll open up May 1st. The pandemic, of course, last year kind of changed our dates of operation, but if nothing changes and nothing dramatic happens, we'll open up on May 1st. And we do have a big November 10th Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Program that we do each year, but that's been a closed event due to the pandemic for the last couple of years as well. So unfortunately, you missed us for this year. If you go out there now, there's a lot of snow on the ground, and often I'm the only person up there, the only human at Whitefish Point, which is kind of nice sometimes because we'll get 1,200 people a day occasionally that will come through on a busy summer day. But we'll open on May 1st, and keep an eye on our website, shipwreckmuseum.com, and you can get a little better idea of some of the projects we're working on at this point.
Excellent. We'll be sure to follow you. Bruce, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for being here. This, as I said, is our last lecture for 2021. It has been a growing year as we started our virtual programs in the spring and moved into this hybrid design, which I hope seems to be going well for everybody. While this is our last lecture for this year, we do still have at least one more event coming up. This Saturday is the Christmas tree ship, which arrives at the National Museum of the Great Lakes around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. For those of you unable to be there in person, we'll actually be streaming Santa's arrival via tugboat on our Facebook page starting around 12:45. This year, in partnership with United Way of Greater Toledo and 211, we're working with the East Toledo Family Center, Family House, Lucas County Children's Services, and the Sylvania Area Family Services to distribute trees to families in need. There are still a few trees available for you to sponsor if you would like to. One of our first programs in 2022 will be the kickoff of our brand new book club. We have 3 books picked out for the first 3 book club meetings, and you can get those on our store at our online store, nmglstore.org, and buy them as a bundle. And if you do, you will get first choice of what discussion group you want to join. The groups, it's a novel, The Dock Porter, and then two historical ones. Oh my gosh, I can't compete with a Chow. The Dawn of Detroit, A Chronicle of Slavery and Freedom in the City and in the City of the Straits. And then more of a more recent, The Living Great Lakes, Searching for the Heart of the Inland Seas. Again, you can pick those all up on our online store. Please don't forget, if you're not a member, now's a great time to join. If you are a member and want to share your love of Great Lakes history with other family members, consider giving a Christmas gift or holiday gift of a membership to the National Museum of the Great Lakes, especially an Inland Seas membership where you can read our journal up to 4 times a year. We are also in the middle of our annual fund appeal, so please remember how much you enjoy these lectures when you consider making a donation to the National Museum of the Great Lakes before the end of the year. Thank you again, Bruce, for your time. Thank you, everybody who's been on. Thank you for those of you who are in Toledo at the watch party. I hope everybody has a really safe and happy holiday season. And we will see you all either this Saturday or next year. All right.
Thanks a lot, Carrie.
Yep.
Thanks everybody who attended.
Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.